I don't think most consumers pick up on it. I guess I would say in the spirits business, historically, there's just a lot of shadiness. It's just a shady business.
If anybody said it's a shady industry, I would take great offense to that.
You see a name and a state on the label, and you assume that that's where it came from.
It can be very hard to figure out who's actually distilling their own whiskey.
In February of 2018, Chuck Schumer went to Kentucky, the heart of bourbon country, and gave a speech at the University of Louisville, during which he made an unexpected proclamation.
It turns out that Brooklyn produces some of the best bourbon in the world.
As a Kentuckian, I know that's going to meet a lot of stiff opposition and pushback. It was pretty bold of Chuck Schumer to do that.
Widow Jane is distilled right around the corner from the apartment where I've lived for more than 30 years. And as a thank you for his invitation.
But unbeknownst to Chuck Schumer, the bottle that he had gifted to Mitch McConnell was actually distilled in Kentucky and bottled in Brooklyn.
You can hardly blame the New York senator for the mistake. Widow Jane built its reputation as a Brooklyn brand. It does have a storefront and distillery in the Red Hook neighborhood, where they tout their whiskey's lore and deep roots to New York State. So it's easy to see how you could think all their whiskey was made in Brooklyn. But as is true for many craft brands, the image they project and what they're actually selling in mass don't exactly align. Because while Widow Jane does make some Brooklyn bourbon, it's pretty hard to find outside their storefront. On the other hand, the famous 10-year-old bourbon, the one sold across New York State, the country, and abroad, that product isn't distilled in Brooklyn at all. And why not? It could have something to do with how hard and costly it is to distill good whiskey.
The whiskey industry and the whiskey consumption in America has been soaring for the last 10 years.
Craft distilleries, like craft brewers before them, have exploded in popularity, going from about 100 distillers to more than 1,300 in the span of 10 years.
Increasing demand and supply just barely keeping up. I think the folks that are making small batch and local whiskeys are part of that larger culinary trend towards interest in our food sourcing. Having whiskey made in your backyard is part of that whole phenomenon. Consumers are definitely interested in that type of spirit.
So what does it take to make that type of spirit? Colin Spolman, the co-founder and master distiller for Kings County Distillery in Brooklyn, which does actually distill, barrel, age, and bottle all its own whiskey, explains it.
So this is the main production floor. This is actually where all the whiskey is mashed, fermented, and distilled. 250 gallons of boiling water. We'll add 300 pounds of corn and cook it into a very thick corn pudding. After we separate out all the solids, then that sort of sugary, sweet, yellowish liquid is pumped into one of these fermenters. Sprinkle yeast over the top of this big vat, and they will exhale carbon dioxide and then produce alcohol. Boiling the alcohol to vapor, so that alcohol vapor travels up through this part of the still, vertical copper pipes that has cold water running through it, and when the alcohol vapor hits that, it'll condense and then run out the front of the still into a tank for collection.
That spirit gets distilled once more, and then it gets barreled.
Bourbon or rye whiskey made in the United States must age in oak barrels, and so that's what we're surrounded by here.
And that's where things get economically complicated for craft whiskey distillers.
Whiskey is special because it's an aged product, and that sort of gets to the crux of why people are sourcing whiskey.
Remember this term, sourcing whiskey.
Sourcing whiskey, because it takes much more time to make whiskey than it does a spirit like vodka or gin, which doesn't require any aging.
For many, many craft whiskey brands, it's financially prohibitive to build their own distillery, undertake that entire distilling process, and then wait years to actually sell anything. And that's where sourcing whiskey comes in. Sourcing whiskey takes a number of forms, but the basic gist of it is large commercial distilleries like MGP take their already aged quality whiskey and wholesale it to smaller brands. The craft brands then cut the barrels down to proof by adding water, bottle the product, and sell it under their own label.
We sell them a product and they turn it into a brand. Their concept, their marketing, their packaging, it helps brands get started quicker. It helps brands diversify their supply chain, and it also helps brands be more innovative.
MGP's distillery in Lawrenceburg, Indiana is a massive operation. To put it in perspective, Kings County Distillery outputs about 3,000 cases a year. But MGP?
We are very large. We supply over 1 million cases of bourbon a year to the industry.
Companies like MGP are vital players in the whiskey industry because it's not just craft brands that source whiskey. It's rampant across labels, minuscule to massive alike. It's a huge external supply chain brands don't exactly want to promote. And in turn, MGP closely guards its clients' anonymity.
We don't give out our actual specifics, but we think the confidentiality agreement works well for both sides. We also don't like to tell other people who our good customers are.
It can be opaque to try to find who's sourcing whiskey from where.
Some brands are upfront about when they're sourcing whiskey, like High West Distillery, for example.
It's fully transparent, and people love that whiskey. It's financially successful, and it's in great demand.
Others trade in marketing or misdirection to sell consumers sourced whiskey.
I look at a sourced whiskey company mostly as a marketing company and a branding company. I think our goals are different. I think if you're selling sourced whiskey, you're more there to make money as opposed to making whiskey.
Lyndon Muth says sourcing whiskey isn't the problem. It's how brands market that source whiskey.
It's not the crime, it's the cover-up. If you're transparent with consumers, they're going to appreciate the whiskey for what it is. Where these brands get into trouble is when they attempt to deceive, and that's fairly easy to do with a little sleight of hand on your labeling and your backstory.
In one such sleight of hand, among many in the industry, Widow Jane says their limestone-rich water comes from a tap into a mine named Widow Jane, which is in Rosendale, New York. But the historical society that owns that mine told NBC News that's not true. The distillery also touts a story about how the mine got its name, the story that the spokesperson claims came from a local. But the Historical Society's president said that version is, quote, ludicrous. But their label does follow the letter of the law with regards to sourcing.
It's on the back of our bottle, and I think that if it's of interest and you're a connoisseur who is very interested, that you can find out by flipping over the bottle.
Widow Jane says the majority of their sales are from Kentucky-sourced bourbons, and sourcing will continue to be part of their business model. When asked by NBC News about future production, the company said it planned to eventually distill all their own whiskey in New York, a move that could take a decade to become operational. So, when you go to your local liquor store to pick up a bottle of whiskey, what can you take away from all this?
If it doesn't say distilled by, if it says produced by, made by, bottled by, anything other than distilled, there's a really good chance that that whiskey was made by someone other than the name and address on the bottle.
MGP contends its place in the industry has been a rising tide, lifting all boats.
I think we have been very instrumental in helping the bourbon category grow. Without us, there wouldn't have been as many brands. Without as many brands, there wouldn't have been as much marketing investment behind the brands. And without that, there wouldn't be as much consumer interest. So it certainly has accelerated the consumer interest in the category, which has been good for all the people in the industry.
And ultimately, consumers can and should figure it out for themselves.
Consumers are a little more astute than we give them credit for. The consumer really wants a product that he likes, that he understands. The clamor for transparency, I don't think is really coming from consumers. If they like the end product, which is a combination of the packaging and the brand concept and the story, and also the actual product, they're happy.
I think in marketing, everybody wants a great backstory. Of course, I think people are going to either try to conjure those stories or fabricate them because marketing works. And these are sort of the things that appeal to a lot of whiskey drinkers.
You have a pretty wide group of marketers who are trying to emulate that sort of Kentucky authenticity. The story about old grandpa so-and-so's secret recipe is a story that we've heard so many times that aside from those that can tell that story with a straight face and have some truth to it, the remainder are struggling a little bit to distinguish themselves.
If you're under the impression that you're buying something made locally, supporting your local community, the person making that should be truthful about it.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.